Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones of Standards Plus History Academy. This is Tuesday morning, the 23rd of April. Can't believe we're getting close to the end of April, which for me as a teacher means we're getting closer to summer vacation. Although the weather doesn't feel like it. All right, we're continuing our look at Conspirator 2 in the JFK assassination. On Friday, episode 80, we did a little background dive into the Kennedy family and its ties to organized crime, going back to Daddy Joe. Yesterday, at episode 81, we examined the situation for organized crime and organized labor, which are sort of kind of in there together in the 50s, and how life got tough for them. Government really cracked down and began opening up the books, so to speak, exposing to the American people and to J. Edgar Hoover that organized crime was actually much more influential than previously thought. And so we are approaching the seminal moment, which is going to be a marriage of government organized crime in an attempt to affect foreign policy. And that's what we want to look at today. How does Cuba factor into all this? Because it is a fact. It's just an undisputable fact that Cuba and the foreign policy related to Cuba is a major, major contributing factor to the JFK assassination. It's a major, major fact to pretty much everything that was going on early on in the Kennedy administration. I mean, from Bay of Pigs on, it's a big deal. And of course, we're in the Cold War, and the front of the Cold War has moved from Berlin to Havana. And it's one thing you can kind of separate yourself, remove yourself intellectually in your mind from the Cold War by saying, well, it's far away. It's over in Europe somewhere, the front. But when it moves 90 miles off your shore, all of a sudden it's in your backyard. So we need to discuss today to add in, we're creating a pot of stew here. We've thrown in the Kennedy ingredient. We've thrown in the organized crime and organized labor ingredients yesterday. And today we're going to throw in the Cuba ingredient and where this obsession with this little island comes from. So a little backstory today, we're going to be looking at the question, how did a World War II deal result in a lucrative partnership of legitimate and illegitimate interests in Cuba? Keyword there in that whole sentence being lucrative. Very, very lucrative. So we're going to be looking at a pretty prominent organized crime individual figure, Lucky Luciano, today. And I've briefly mentioned him before when we were talking about Frank Costello. Frank Costello took over for Lucky Luciano. He was in that same organized crime family. That was years later. This is back in the 40s. So we're going back a little bit to show what I really want you to get out of this is to show that, people think, well, CIA and the mafia worked together to try to assassinate Castro. That didn't happen until 59, 60. No, this arrangement, this marriage between government and mafia goes back to the 40s. It predates World War II, actually, and has then continued intermittently since. So that's a top picture there. You see Thomas Dewey, a future presidential candidate, acting as a prosecutor for the state of New York against Lucky Luciano, and he wins that case. Lucky Luciano ends up in prison for a very long time. Um, the bottom picture is a map of the sort of a reconstitution of the Golden Triangle drug trade, which is going to come about. We're going to talk about that today. Drugs coming out of the Golden Triangle, Southeast Asia primarily, making it to France, and then from France to Cuba, and then from Cuba to the United States. That's what we call the French connection. So when you're looking at that, trust me, these will all tie together. Then the top picture here is of a casino, a hotel casino in Havana. They're in the heydays of the 50s when organized crime turned Havana into a rich man's playground. And that's where you went to have a little fun, spend a little money, and turns out spend a lot of money actually. And organized crime had a sweet deal going in Havana with the hotels and the casinos and the brothels and all of the business interests that they had, illegitimate, which, according to estimates, of course, organized crime doesn't do a yearly tax return, so we don't know for sure. But in those days, yearly estimates say that they were bringing in $100 million a year profit. Okay, that's after expenses and all. Profit. That's a hefty chunk of change. That's going to be, they're going to want to protect that. And the advantage, obviously, is it's offshore. So there's no U.S. laws in Cuba that govern any of their activities over there. So it's about the best of both worlds. Make a lot of money, and you're away from prying eyes. The bottom picture, and trust me, I could have had 100 of these, are U.S. legitimate business interests in Cuba. This is the Hershey Corporation. Obviously, it's sugar. Sugar is a big mover and shaker in the economic policy, foreign policy that the United States and Cuba enjoyed during the 50s. We had a nice sweetheart deal with our little puppet dictator down there, Batista. And he pretty much let the United States come in and own everything. We owned everything of value in Cuba, the sugar plantations, the mining interests, the public transportation, public utilities. I mean, you just go through, it's a long list. Cuba was like an ATM machine for the United States, both from a legitimate business enterprise point of view and also from an illegitimate business enterprise point of view. Cuba was a cash cow for the United States in the 50s until this guy came along. Fidel Castro, the July 26th movement, which was a revolution advertised to get rid of the U.S. puppet government regime, which a lot of the Cuban nationals didn't like. He was a very repressive dictator to the locals because his position there depended on a cozy relationship with the United States. That's how he made his money. That's how he kept his power. And Fidel Castro was advertised himself as a man of the people, said Cuba is for Cubans, and led a long, sustained drive out of the mountains into Havana to accomplish this revolution. And of course, one of the first things he does is honor his promise and kick all the Americans out. And we'll talk about that today. And that's going to have ramifications, obviously, because the United States has a lot of money tied up in Cuba. So, what I've learned, and even my students pick up on this, and maybe it's the way I teach it, I don't know, but almost always these things come down to money. Almost always. All right, so let's talk about this government mafia backstory, which begins, as I said, in the early 40s, 1943 specifically. And of course, If you know your history, you know we're in the middle of World War II at this point. The war has changed in our favor. 41 was a terrible year. It was the year of Pearl Harbor, and we lost in the Pacific to the Japanese. We were on a long losing streak in 41. We lost the Philippines. We lost a bunch of islands. Obviously, we lost Pearl Harbor. And it appeared that the Japanese were on a roll, and they were. And we had some little symbolic victories with Doolittle's raid. And we had this battle in the Coral Sea where it was the first time enemy forces faced each other from aircraft carrier but groups, which neither side could see the other. The planes met in the middle in the skies and dogfight. I don't know if I'm saying that right. They had a dogfight. And it's the first time in a battle head to head with the Japanese. We didn't lose. We didn't win, but we didn't lose. It was sort of a tie. And that sort of started to turn things around. And we had a really great stroke of good luck at Midway. And Admiral Nimitz turned the war around in the Pacific for us with a brilliant strategy of playing hide and seek with the Japanese Navy. And when their planes left their carriers to attack Midway, which we laid out there like a gigantic piece of bait, we snuck in behind and attacked their carriers, which were largely undefended at that point. We sunk a bunch of their carriers. Japan, without a strong carrier group, was nothing. That was the essence of their military force. And from that point on, the war turned in our favor. We were on offense, playing the island hopping strategy, working our way closer and closer to Japan. So that's where we are in the Pacific, kind of in a holding pattern, waiting, getting closer slowly but surely to Japan. In Europe, in 43, the Germans, which had been on a big time roll after France, and then they bombed the living hell out of England with the Blitz. But Churchill had figured out Hitler's weakness, and that was that Hitler had a short attention span, and he wanted to win quick, which is why he used the Blitzkrieg and the Blitz and overwhelming force. He'd get these countries to surrender in 30 days or 2 weeks or a couple days. And that's the way he wanted the whole war to go. And, Churchill's strategy was just hang in there. He kept telling the British people, just hang in there, hang in there, hang in there. Hitler will get bored. He'll do something stupid. And sure enough, he did. He invaded Russia, which was the dumbest decision. I mean, he made some dumb decisions. Dunkirk wasn't very smart. There's a good movie out on Dunkirk, which kind of shows the backstory about Hitler trying to negotiate quietly with the British government. The British government slow planned that while the ships brought all the troops off the beaches of Dunkirk, never intending to negotiate a settlement with Hitler, but strung him along just long enough to make that happen, that miracle happen. So, and they're doing the same thing in the Blitz. They're just hanging in there. And London is burning, but they're not quitting. They're not giving up. A lot of that you have to give credit to Churchill and his identification of Hitler's major weakness. So Hitler gets distracted and he invades Russia, double crosses Stalin, and that's the beginning of his demise because he's now created for himself a two-front war. He's going to be fighting the Soviets in the East, which are also going to play that Churchillian game. They're not going to give up either. Stalin's just as bullheaded as Hitler, probably more so. Bullheaded as Churchill. You had some pretty strong characters here. And so they're creating for themselves a nightmare of a two-front war. They're going to have to be fighting the Soviets in the East. The United States is now, as a result of D-Day's not, as a result of D-Day is now, well, D-Day hasn't happened yet, but it's about to. They're going to be on France, but they've helped retake North Africa and kick the Germans, Rommel out of North Africa, and the next item on the agenda is to land in Italy. And that means you got to take Sicily first, which is offshore, then you got to land in Italy. If you can land in Italy, the idea is we'll work our way up the boot, up to the Alps, across the Alps into Germany, and that'll be our entry point into Germany. Now we know, because we can look back on it, that that didn't work, primarily because of the Alps. And Germans got dug in on the Alps, and they had the high ground, they had the advantage. It's going to take forever to get through that. So we came up with a reroute plan, which is to land at Normandy and go through France instead. But that hasn't happened yet. Right now, we are trying to figure out how to land in Italy. And we've got Lucky Luciano, as a result of the prosecution that we mentioned earlier by Thomas Dewey, serving a 30 to 50-year term, according to the charging documents, for, quote, white slavery, prostitution, and a call girl ring. All the organized crime activities that Lucky Luciano was involved in, we got him in prison for 30 to 50 years for white slavery. Anyway, our government is looking for help, any help we can get, in making this landing in Italy. And so through Thomas Dewey, who is the special prosecutor who put him in prison, and he's the future governor of New York and a future presidential candidate. So this guy's plugged in to the political scene. A deal is offered to Lucky Luciano. And the deal is, the United States will commute your sentence, which obviously he's going to be in, there's going to be some motivation there to get out of prison when you're facing 50 years possibly. In exchange, Lucky Luciano, with all his connections to Sicily and Italy, you're going to need to leave the United States, you're going to return to Sicily, and you're going to enlist the help of the Sicilian and Italian Cosa Nostra, in other words, the mafia, from your home country. We want you to go back to Sicily and Italy, and you're a big name there, and you'll be able to recruit all of these mafiosos still live in the home country to aid us, the Allies, as we prepare to land in Sicily and eventually Italy. We need you to act as scouts. We need you to act as saboteurs. We need you to infiltrate the enemy and act as fifth column saboteurs and things of that nature. Any help that you can provide. Misdirection, misinformation will be spread by you guys and your, quote, yellow ribbon brigade, which is what they were called. So we need help landing in Sicily and Italy, number one. Number two, we've got another problem, that is the docks here at home. We think they're being infiltrated by communists and radicals. And these are folks that are working against the war effort. They might even be Nazis. And they are sabotaging our docks. And of course, that's where we're sending all this man and material off to provide for the war effort. And it's part of their strategy these radicals are anti-war. They certainly are against our involvement in the war. Hitler's got Nazi agents trying to sabotage any contribution America can make to the war before their goods and their men get to Europe and can make a big difference. Why not sabotage them right here on our shores before they even get over to Europe? So we have two operations that we need out of the criminal element that Lucky Luciano oversees. Operation Husky is the operation to infiltrate and sabotage in Sicily and Italy, and Operation Underworld is to infiltrate the American Teamsters Union and the Longshoremen's Association. These are the folks that run the docks, and use their special skills to root out these communists, these radicals, and potentially even these Nazi agents. This is a tacit admission by the United States government that they can't do it. these infiltrators know who to watch out for. And they recognize a U.S. agent, an FBI guy, somebody from the United States government. They recognize him right away. And so they just don't blend in, but your guys will blend in. They'll fit right in, those Teamsters Union, those Longshoremen's Association, those dock workers. And basically we gave them permission. It's a good movie out about this, and I can't remember the name of it, but it shows what these mafiosos did to these infiltrators when they caught them. I mean, it was terrible stuff. They'd take them to steel mills, throw them in the smelting furnaces. You know, first they get names out of them. They get them right up next to a smelting furnace, which is burning, raging hot furnace, and threaten to throw them in there unless they give them names of all their buddies who have infiltrated. And after they got all the names, they'd throw them in the furnace anyway. And we let that happen because they were in short order cleaning up those docks, and all the problems that we were having went away. They did such a bang up job, but they were willing to do things that our government officials couldn't do. FBI agent can't throw a guy in a smelting furnace, but these mafiosos, we just kind of like we see no evil, hear no evil, whatever it takes, do whatever it takes to clean up these docks. And they did. And of course, if you know your history, you know that the landing in Sicily turned out to be easier than we thought. And then the landing in southern Italy turned out to be easier than we thought. And a lot of that credit, that success, goes to this Yellow Ribbon Brigade that Lucky Luciano put together to help. Like, for example, you see in this picture, this is one of those locals who's been recruited into the Yellow Ribbon Brigade, who's acting as a scout and a guide. This is a foreign territory. Nobody knows the land better than these guys do. And they would embed themselves. They'd be embedded right in with the U.S. Invading forces and point the way. And of course, they had a network of spies, and they knew where the hot spots were to avoid. They knew where the spots were to go. And it really aided our cause. Landings are hard. We found out in Normandy, landings are extremely hard. That's one of the reasons why Truman was dreading having to land in Japan, another island, because hopscotching our way through the Pacific to Japan, every island landing was brutal. It was terrible. And so, but if you can have somebody local, somebody who's already there, like an advance force, sort of like a Yellow Ribbon Brigade, they sort of acted as an advance force. They could prepare the way for you. It really softens the landing. And our landing in Sicily went very, very well. Our landing in southern Italy went very, very well. And pretty soon we're working our way up the boot. And it looks like we're going to be up and over the Alps in no time. And a lot of that success and credit goes to this Yellow Ribbon Brigade. And what I'm saying is the mafia, Cosa Nostra, Lucky Luciano, helped the U.S. government in two ways to help us win the war. They helped us on the foreign front in Sicily and Italy, and they helped us at home on the docks, rooting out the Nazis and the communists and the radicals and all the saboteurs and infiltrators on the docks that were making life hell for us, trying to supply the war effort. So this is a case in 43, 44 where Lucky Luciano and the organized crime syndicate in America did its patriotic duty. Now, of course, their motives were completely altruistic. Lucky Luciano was looking to get out of prison, but he had something, a special skill to offer. And so that was that was something he could trade for his freedom. And they did a great job of it. They emerged as one of the big contributors to our war effort. Nobody talks about it. It's not in the history books, but Operation Husky and Operation Underworld were very successful operations that helped us win World War II. This is a picture of these docks. These are enemy collaborators. And you've got a toxic mix here. You've got enemy collaborators, which are the ones they're looking for. You've got organized crime figures blending in, tending to be workers, and U.S. Navy agents who the organized crime figures basically trained how to blend in with these people and help them. And together, they were able to root out all of these enemy agents. This is the famous Fulton Fish Market, which in New York City. So anyway, you've got organized crime sort of leading the charge and showing the United States government how to root these people out and how to protect the integrity of our docks. At the same time, helping our troops over in Europe accomplish landings in both Sicily and Italy. So if you're Lucky Luciano, if you're organized crime, you got to feel good about the future because you've done a solid for the United States government in their moment of crisis. And this is one of the reasons why the 50s was so, they were so distraught about what was happening in the 50s. They felt double crossed. You know, they said, wait a second. When you asked us, we stepped up. We helped you. What do we do to deserve this kind of treatment in the 50s? Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but there was another element to this whole thing. Besides the help that the criminal organized crime was providing the docks in Italy, there was another little less talked about venture. It's called, we call it the French Connection. Basically, the CIA was in the business of smuggling opium and heroin out of the Golden Triangle. This was going forward. Now, of course, we know that CIA wasn't actually formed until 47. All right, but this is the beginning stages of, this is what the OSS, which is the forerunner to the CIA's beginning, the CIA will pick up on. And it'll run all the way up until 1960, which is the year that we're sort of aiming for here. So this, I'm giving you the backstory. So between 43 going up to 60, the CIA helped put together, and remember now, the CIA doesn't exist till 47. So for the first 4 years, it was the OSS. But this relationship that the United States government has formed with organized crime. By the time the CIA is created in 47, it's a fully formed relationship. And the CIA knows that in its efforts to smuggle opium and heroin out of the Golden Triangle, i.e. Southeast Asia, through Sicily, Italy, and France, who would be better in helping negotiate all that? Who could be better business partners than organized crime? Organized crime, as demonstrated by their help in the landing at Sicily and Italy, has all the connections that they need. And there's a mafia in France called the Corsican Mafia, sort of like brothers, that they can work out a relationship with them as well. And what the plan is to smuggle the opium and heroin out of Southeast Asia, use Sicily, Italy, and France as a sort of a stopping off point on their way to Cuba. All right. And if we can control the government of Cuba, which we did through Fulgencio Batista, and we have a mafia connection in Cuba, which we did with Santos Traficante, we can smuggle all that opium and heroin into Cuba and then prepare for its ultimate destination, which is the inner cities, the inner city neighborhoods of the United States. And the plan was to pollute. This is a highly controversial topic, but the U.S. government actually had a plan to intentionally target the inner cities and the African-American populations of the inner cities with these drugs, and it accomplished several purposes for them, which are other issues that we aren't going to get into. But that was the French Connection. The drugs the drugs are opium and heroin. They're coming from Southeast Asia. The halfway point, or the stopping off point in Europe, is Sicily, Italy, and France. Of course, Sicily and Italy are controlled by organized crime, as is France, the Corsican Mafia. We will use now the connections that we have established through World War II with these mafiosos. These will be our new business partners to smuggle these drugs into Cuba under the arrangement of a business partnership with Fulgencio Batista. Of course, he'll get big kickbacks. Santos Traficante will be involved in this as well because he is the mafioso in charge of Cuba. So nothing happens in any of these countries without the permission, without the approval of whoever the mob boss is there. In Cuba, it's Santos Traficante. And then from there, they'll be smuggled from Cuba into the United States and the inner cities. The profits from this enterprise laundered through a CIA front company called SEA, the C Company, which stands for Southeast Asia. It's called the Sea Supply Corporation. And then these profits were forwarded to the Chinese Kuomintang, who were fighting against the communists and Mao Zedong. Now, this becomes a model. Okay, we use this same model. We've talked about it prior with the Contras later on. You remember Iran-Contra? We're running drugs in through Latin America, and the profits from those drugs we're using to prop up the Contras in Nicaragua, since Congress cut off all their funding. So this is a way the CIA learned through drugs to make a lot of money and pay for their pet causes. And it was all cash, it was untraceable. And, no taxpayer, no government oversight, no audits, no congressional oversight. It's just free money that you can parcel out to whomever you want. And in the aftermath of World War II, it's going to be the Chinese trying to stop the spread of communism into China. And later in the 80s, it's going to be the Contras trying to fight against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Again, another anti-communist effort. So this becomes a model for the CIA, but it starts here in post-World War II with this French connection, where they have all these connections. Our U.S. government has all these connections built up with these organized crime figures as a result of the two deals that they made prior during World War II with Lucky Luciano. And this is when the U.S. government and organized crime go into business together. So when we fast forward to this whole issue we're going to be getting into with Cuba, this isn't anything new. This is a long-standing relationship the United States government has with organized crime. And it's morphed into different things as different needs arise over different periods of time. But the relationship started back in 43 with Lucky Luciano. And then we have these periods like we talked about yesterday, like the 50s, where the government goes after these organized crime figures. And you can understand now why a Santos Traficante, for example, as we get into the late 50s and 60s, and the government's coming after him, would be mystified. What the heck? I helped you run all your drugs. In the French Connection, I was the final stopping point before these drugs came into the inner cities here in the United States. I made that possible. And now you're coming after me? And you can understand why they would be upset with the Kennedys for serving on that committee and Bobby going after him the way he did, when it was Bobby's daddy, Joe, who made all that money during Prohibition, again, working with organized crime figures to smuggle alcohol across the Canadian border along the East Coast, make the Kennedy family a huge fortune. So we are creating a big pot of stew, and it's a toxic brew, because you got all these entanglements and these connections, these hypocrisies. The Kennedys are going to end up being in charge of the government at 60, going after the very organization that made their family rich, famous, and powerful. And of course, that's not lost on the organized crime figures. They understand the history. They're not stupid. Uh, and the United States government in the 50s is going to go after the same organized crime figures that helped make the CIA all this money to fight communists in China through the drug smuggling operation. And so every time you turn around, organized crime is making these deals with the US government and then getting its legs cut out from under it later when it's convenient, or maybe it's inconvenient for the government to admit that they have any relationship with these folks. So they put on this big show and go after them. Well, at some point, organized crime is going to say enough's enough, you know. So I just want to explain the backstory here as we proceed. And I don't want to sound like I'm taking the side of organized crime. I'm just saying, hey, business is what it is. But there's a lot more double crossing going on here than just the Kennedys double crossing, the mob. The U.S. government was double crossing the mob as well after the mob basically saved their bacon in World War II and helped to make all this money during the French Connection. So, you can understand why there's no love lost between these two entities. You can also understand why Santos Traficante, when he's asked to put the S-Force together, is very smart in saying, okay, all right, you've done me wrong a few times here. I understand how this works. They're going to ask me to put this S-Force together to assassinate Castro. And if something goes wrong, they're going to hang it all around my neck. So I'm going to recruit Operation 40 guys they were originally my guys, but I loaned them to the CIA for Operation 40. So they're now CIA guys. They've been on the CIA payroll. So he's smart to recruit back Operation 40 guys, knowing that the CIA would go to the ends of the world to hide the connections of these. If something goes wrong with Operation 40 or with the S-Force, they're going to move heaven and earth to hide the connections that those S-Force members had to Operation 40, because Operation 40 was a CIA op. So Santos Traficante, by the time that whole S-Force scenario comes about that we've talked about in earlier episodes, is smart because he's gone through all this and he's learned the hard way that the U.S. government can't be trusted, that the Kennedys can't be trusted. When push comes to shove, they'll double cross you. Now, I'm sure, I am completely positive, actually, having studied this, that organized crime double crossed everybody along the way as well. So you have two partners that are really not trustworthy doing business with each other. What do they say? There's no honor among thieves. Yeah, that's very much true. All right, so we've established that and that little partnership going on. Let's talk about how Cuba becomes America's ATM machine, both from a legitimate business standpoint and an illegitimate business standpoint. All right, so we have our guy, his name is Batista, in charge in Cuba, and basically he's our puppet. And his job is to facilitate the American business enterprise that is involved in all things related to Cuba, so profits can be maximized. Ultravires, it's all about profits, right? It's not about what's right or what's wrong. It's not about the public interest. Nobody cares about the Cubans in any of this scenario. It's just about making money. So during the time of the 50s, when things are a little bit hellish for organized crime in America, times are really, really good for legitimate business, American businesses in Cuba, and illegitimate, which means organized crime. American companies owned 40% of the Cuban sugar industry, 80% of the Cuban utilities, and 90% of Cuba's mining companies. All right, so Cuba is like a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States. It's like a colony, though it's technically not. And for all practical matters, it is. And then the organized crime, you can see why they saw such potential in Cuba, because at the same time, the U.S. government is cracking down on them at home. they're making $100 million profit operating their casinos, their hotels, houses of prostitution in Cuba. And so that's fast becoming the place to get away from the heavy hand, the boot of the United States government and make all your money over there. So Cuba is like I said, it is a cash cow for the United States, but not just the legitimate businesses, also the illegitimate. But everybody had their hand out, and Cuba was making money for the United States hand over fist. Just a few pictures here. This is a California and Hawaiian sugar company based in Cuba. These are some of the public utilities that the Americans owned in Cuba. This is a nickel mine. We owned a lot of mines in Cuba in the 50s. This is just one of them. And so 1950s Havana was literally swimming in US dollars. It's kind of interesting. You know, I've heard people say, I've never been to Cuba myself, but I've heard people say that have been there or know people who have been there. If you go to Cuba now, it's like stuck in a time warp, that the cars are all old and the buildings are all old. You can see it used to have a lot of money, but it's kind of wore down now. It's sort of a memorial to good times past. But a lot of the cars are from this 50s era, this 50s decade when all of this relationship between the United States and Cuba was like we had this symbiotic relationship with each, this is where a lot of American money went to be spent. And these rich men would bring over their toys and their cars. So, but then after Castro takes over, we have this falling out and the embargo is put in place and we break off all trade with them. All that stopped. And so they're stuck with all the vestiges of the 50s. You still see cars over there from the 50s. You still see buildings that were clearly palaces in their time, but now they're all worn down, broken down. And it's kind of like it's kind of like one of the old Western ghost towns. It's become that. But in the 50s, this was the hot spot. And, anything new that was coming out of the United States ended up in Havana. And so for a period of time, though they had a corrupt government, and there was this revolutionary movement afoot up in the mountains led by Fidel Castro, and the Cuban people definitely resented the Big Brother, the influence of Big Brother on their country and how corrupt their politicians were and how beholden they were to the United States, how second class they'd become. There was no denying the fact that Havana was a beautiful, beautiful location to go. It was a tourist destination. It was a place to go spend money. And so it's kind of like you get the best of both. You get it's a good news, bad news situation is what I'm trying to say. You got a lot of money flowing through your capital, flowing through your country, a lot of American dollars, but you're being led by a very corrupt government, and you're really not being led by your government at all. America's making all the decision, and these mafiosos are making all the decision. You just kind of happen to live there. So this is why the Castro's movement really takes off. They called it the 26th of July movement. Here is the sort of the termination of that. On New Year's Eve, 1959, Castro finally rolls into Havana. And I'm going back to that movie scene again. If you watch The Godfather, they show this episode, how this whole scenario about Michael Corleone is trying to decide, should I invest in this big business enterprise here in Cuba, while he's fully aware of this revolution and how it could upset everything. And he went over to Cuba to kind of gauge the strength of this revolution. Could it succeed? Or does this American puppet Batista have a firm control on power over there. And what he determines is that Batista's does not have a firm grasp on the power. The people are behind Castro. And if he invests all this family money in this Cuba operation at this late date, he might lose it. And indeed, he was right. While he was there on that New Year's Eve, as they're doing the dance and the balls dropping, celebrating the new year, Castro's tanks roll into Havana. And everyone's pell-mell trying to escape. You know, Batista's getting on a plane. All the mafiosos are getting on planes. They're leaving so fast. They don't even have time to get their money out of the banks or get their cash out of their safes or whatever. They just leave, as many of them as possible, because they all understand what's fixing to happen. The American puppet, the protection that they have all enjoyed under this American puppet is going away. And all of these illegitimate mafiosos, this organized crime element that's been making $100 million a year at Cuba's expense, basically, are now public enemies number one to this new government. And what America does not count on, they kind of assume that's going to happen when Castro takes over, that the organized crime is going to be out. And that's a problem, but they can deal with that. What becomes a bigger problem is when he also targets the legitimate interests, the American companies, the sugar companies, the mining companies, the public utilities, et cetera, et cetera. So here you see headlines, New York paper, Batista flees Cuba, Castro in control. So now the question is, these money spigots that have been flowing throughout the decade of the 50s as a result of this cozy relationship we've nurtured with Cuba, as a result of our puppet that's been in charge of Cuba, what's going to happen to those money spigots? And of course, Castro makes it clear right off the bat, he's going to turn those money spigots off. He nationalizes all of the American industries. He puts fences up around the American properties that we owned, padlocks the gates, and said, Cuba is for Cubans. And he kicks out all the U.S. corporations. And he claims them for Cuba. And so all of a sudden, Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola and California Hawaiian Sugar and GE and all these big companies that have been making a fortune legitimately, in Cuba during the reign of Batista, are now out. They're frozen out. All their assets have been seized. They're on the outside looking in. And this is when Eisenhower, Eisenhower's in charge at this point. He slaps embargo on Cuba. And he's basically saying, I'm going to, you depend on our money to make it. So we're just going to, you're going to seize all of our assets. We're going to stop buying your sugar. We're going to stop paying for everything. And you're not going to trade with us anymore. And we forced Cuba into the arms of the Soviets because they needed some customers. They needed a business partner. And if the United States wouldn't be their business partner anymore, because Castro's nationalized all these industries and kicked the mafiosos out, well, they need a new business partner. And this is where the United States really misplays. We just misplay it. We forced the Cubans right into the arms of Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviets. But it was all in an effort to continue the control that we'd had over Cuba during the 50s. So it's estimated that Castro nationalized or seized over $700 million worth of American property. Now, this is in 1959-60. So you can imagine 700 million, what that would be worth today. So you can see fenced off, padlocked, gated, Americans are out. And everywhere you look, the mafiosos and their organizations are being shut down as well. That's one of the first things Castro did, is went around looking for these organized crime figures, anyone who was left, and he captured them. For example, he imprisoned Santos Traficante. the head mafia boss, the guy that we'd been partners with running the French Connection, all those drugs through Cuba. He'd been on our side helping facilitate that French Connection all those years. He'd been partners basically. They had sort of a gangster government over there. He'd been partners with Batista during the 50s. Well, Batista's gone, but Santos Traficante stayed. And so Castro took him prisoner and fully intended to execute him. It was only because of a trip by Jack Ruby in a plane escort. No, he was accompanied by Lee Harvey Oswald, and we've talked about this prior. They make an emergency run over there to talk to Fidel Castro. Of course, Fidel Castro knows Jack Ruby because Jack Ruby ran all these guns to Castro during the revolutionary period when the mafia was kind of supporting both sides, trying to figure out the U.S. mafia is trying to figure out who's going to win over there. We'll support Batista with weapons. We'll support Castro with weapons so that when it's done, either one wins, we at least have influence with whoever the winner is. So not realizing that Castro was going to double cross them and kick all their mafia folks out, take Santos Traficante prisoner, threaten to execute him. So Jack Ruby makes a last-ditch effort to go over and appeal to Castro to release Santos Traficante, which he does. And so Santos Traficante ends up on a plane with Lee Harvey Oswald and with Jack Ruby, and they fly back to Florida, and Santos Traficante sets up shop in Florida. But fully intends to lead a counter-revolution to get rid of Castro so he can go back home. You see how all this is building to this anti-Castro movement? It's so all these mafiosos can go back to Cuba. That's why, and a lot of these Cubans that are going to flee to Miami during this period as refugees, obviously they're anti-Castros. They call them anti-Castorites. That's why they fled. They were fleeing for their lives. But they don't want to make their home in Florida or Miami. They'd like to go home, excuse me. But they're going to have to get rid of Castro to make that happen. So that's where they go into another relationship, the U.S. government, who also wants to get rid of Castro so they can get back in business. So all these U.S. companies can get back in business in Cuba like the 50s. So you see, it's not just the United States government that's losing money because the drug thing gets shut down, right? All of the French Connection goes away once Castro's in power. All the legitimate business interests are now losing money. $700 million worth of assets are now under Castro's control. And organized crime's losing $100 million of profit per year in Cuba, not operating in Cuba. So you have a lot of people in the United States that are very upset that the cash cow has been taken prisoner by Fidel Castro. Cuba is no longer under the control of or under the within the United States sovereignty. We've lost control of the situation. Our guy is gone. The guy who's come in, we've sort of pushed him in now, and he's quickly becoming a Soviet puppet. So it escalates out of control very quickly, where not only are we losing money, and in an effort to get that money back, we pushed them into the arms of the Soviets. So now we have a Soviet proxy 90 miles off our coast. So now it has Cold War implications. It's not just financial anymore. Now it's an issue of national security. So the United States government completely misplayed this. And of course, Richard Nixon's right in the middle of all this. He's the one that met with Castro and gave him the ultimatum. You can't have any dealings with the Soviets. And Castro says, well, you're not going to tell me who I can have dealings with. Cuba's a sovereign nation. I'm the leader of a sovereign nation. I'll have dealings with whomever I want. And he rejected Nixon's demands, basically. And so Nixon goes back and immediately decides to authorize Operation 40. And the covert ops begin against Cuba. And of course, in that same month, he declares his intents to run for president in 1960. So all of this is happening at the same time. And overnight, we've lost all of our influence in Cuba. We've lost the CIA has lost its its money train through this French connection to supply the Kuomintang in China and its struggle against the communists. And of course, that even after that revolution in China was over, the CIA continued this French connection because it was so lucrative, and it provided them with a lot of money they could use and spread around to other causes, which they're now going to use, if they have any left over, for this anti-Cuba, anti-Castro cause. And all the covert ops are going to be launched against them. But that's all gone. And all of the U.S. legitimate businesses, that's all gone. All of the mafioso business, organized crime, that's all gone. Everything's gone. And the solution is to get rid of Castro. If you can get rid of Castro, the way we see it, you get rid of Castro, all this goes back to the way things used to be. It's Castro who kicked out the mafia. It's Castro who nationalized the U.S. businesses. It's Castro and his government who imprisoned Santos Traficante, which shut down the French connection. It's Castro is the boogeyman. So it's interesting. If you listen to the narrative coming out of the White House, coming out of the U.S. government this time, it's not what I just told you. It's not about getting the mafia back in so they can make their money. It's not about reconstituting the French connection so we can continue to pollute our inner cities with these drugs and make all this money, create this big slush fund for the CIA to use however it wants. And you don't hear about that. You don't even hear about the big businesses wanting to go back into Cuba. It's about it's about communism. The threat of communism is now 90 miles off our shore. That is always the cover story. That's always the cover story. But undergirding that whole infrastructure of this anti-communist cause, which the 5412 committee and Nixon and the CIA is going to be on this jihad to get rid of Castro because of his communist ties. Undergirding all that is everybody just lost a lot of money, and they want it back. They want those money spigots back on. This is how we deal with threats to the money spigots. Whenever the money spigots are turned off, a determination is made who cut them off, and a plan is proposed to get rid of that threat so you can turn the money spigots back on. That's what's happening here with Castro. That's what's going to happen later in 3 years with Kennedy. All right. That's where we're headed. So you start to see the propaganda, the yellow press really starts to kick in here. This is reminiscent the Spanish-American War, when, again, over the issue of Cuba, we made the Spanish the boogeyman. Remember, they're starting all these concentration camps, and they're killing all these Cubans. They're mistreating their colony in Cuba. And then it was all about sugar. We wanted to create another colony like we did in Hawaii, which eventually became a territory and a state. We wanted to do the same thing in Cuba we did in Hawaii. It was all about sugar. So our yellow press kicked into gear, and we start demonizing the Spanish and beating the drums for our first foreign war. And, when we get the American people primed, all this anti-Spanish propaganda, anti-Spanish propaganda, anti-Spanish, every day, read the newspapers. Spain did this, Spain did that. Poor Cuba, they're our neighbors for humanitarian purposes. We need to go. All of this the American people are being primed and primed and primed. And at the right moment, we sink the Maine, launch a false flag, blame the Spaniards. And now the American people are like, let's go. What are you waiting on? And we have our first foreign war. All right, here we are again. This time it's Castro. And so, and Castro wasn't a good guy. I'm not saying he was. And I'm sure he did all kinds of terrible things. But now we got to create a war criminal. We got to make him a war criminal that's not supported by the Cuban people. We've got to present it such a way that the Cuban people are captives under this repressive regime. And we would be liberators if we went. I mean, that's what they're going to tell Eisenhower when he green lights the Bay of Pigs. That's what they're going to tell Kennedy when he re-green lights the Bay of Pigs. They tell him, CIA tells him, What? Hey, we're going to liberate the Cuban people. As soon as we land on those shores, the Cuban people are going to join the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it'll be easy peasy. We'll be in and out, and Cuba will be back in business. And Kennedy, kicking himself later, agreed and decided to go along with it. Found out later it was a total trap, and everything he'd been told was a lie. The Cuban people weren't actually in support. They didn't want to be liberated. They actually supported Castro largely, which is how his revolution succeeded. But that's not what we are going to hear. We're going to hear about the war crimes. And indeed, he did commit war crimes. Here's Fidel Castro. You can see a picture of him tying the hands of a victim about ready to be shot or hung, whichever, executed. Che Guevara is to the left. Raul Castro, which is Fidel's brother, is in the middle, and Fidel's to the right. And this poor hapless victim is being tied up to a tree. Now, this is war, and nasty things happen in war. And if you were to ask Fidel Castro his perspective on this was a revolution. Revolution is war sometimes, and you have to do what you have to do. I'm not saying it's right, wrong, or otherwise. I'm saying it's Cuba's business. That's what I'm saying. It's not our business. But we made it our business because of the money at stake. And he is a threat to those money spigots. He's already turned them off. And so in order to turn them back on, we got to get rid of them. So the yellow press kicks in. We start propagandizing the American people. He's over there executing everybody willy-nilly. He's doing this, he's doing that. He's going to make his bed with the Soviets. We're going to have a communist government 90 miles off our shore. That's what all the American people are taught. That's all we know. But really, when you get down to the nub of this, where the rubber meets the road, our issue with Fidel Castro and his new regime was more about the loss of our income, the loss of our control over that income, the loss of our control over that island nation that was so lucrative to so many different constituent groups. It was lucrative to our CIA and intelligence services, to the French Connection. It was lucrative to our legitimate business interests, which means tax dollars to the United States government. It was lucrative to organized crime. It was lucrative to our tourist industry. It was lucrative in so many different ways that when Fidel Castro tied all that off and cut the Americans off, we wanted to get rid of him so we could reopen all that. And our response to Fidel was to cut him off financially and force him into the arms of the Soviets, which we then used as cover to launch covert op after covert op after covert op, assassination attempt after assassination attempt after assassination attempt, a failed invasion at Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a response to the Bay of Pigs. Khrushchev put the missiles in to stop a future invasion. And then our Joint Chiefs say, well, this is our excuse. This is the pretext for us to launch the invasion that we've never launched yet, a full-fledged invasion backed by the United States government this time. It was always the same. We got to get rid of Castro. We got to invade so that we can take Cuba back. We fully viewed Cuba to be within our sphere of influence, which it is technically, but we viewed it as ours, even though the Platt Amendment that we signed with Cuba after the Spanish-American War said Cuba was an independent country, had its own constitution. We exercised some measure of sovereignty there, and we had the final say-so. And we didn't like, here years later, losing control of that sovereignty. We didn't like somebody coming in and saying Cuba is for Cubans, because in our way of thinking, Cuba was for America. The indigenous people, the Cuban people, be damned. It's a colony mindset. That's what it is. It exists for the benefit of the mother country. And we viewed Cuba as our colony, and the United States was its mother country. And so This is where things stand in 1960 as a presidential campaign is kicking off in the United States. And the players are Richard Nixon on one side, you got Kennedy on another. The politics of Cuba are going to be front center stage in this campaign. And these two candidates are going to be in a race to out conservative each other, to out maneuver each other, saying, I'm tougher on Castro. No, I'm tougher on Castro. You're not tough enough. I'm tough. They're like in this, and that includes Kennedy. At the outset, Kennedy was extremely critical of Eisenhower and Nixon and the way that they let Cuba go and their tepid response to Castro and Soviet communism 90 miles off our coast. And of course, that's going to infuriate Nixon because he knows all the covert stuff that's going on, trying to get rid of Castro, but he can't talk about it. It's classified. So this Cuba stuff is going to, it's basically like a stick of dynamite, and it's just waiting for a match. That's all it's waiting for. And the Cuba politics are going to end up getting JFK assassinated. I mean, I'm convinced that 100%. But look at everyone who has a hand in it. You would think, oh, well, Cuba politics, that means the anti-Castro Cubans did it. Well, no, because the mafia had as much interest in Cuba as the anti-Castro Cubans did. So it was the mafia who did it. Well, no, because the CIA had as much interest in Cuba as the anti-Castro Cubans did and as the mafia did. So it was the CIA who did it. Well, no, because the U.S. military, the Joint Chiefs, had as much interest in Cuba because of the missiles that were aimed at us in Cuba and the presence of Soviet troops. And we're in the middle of the Cold War. And now the Cold War front has moved from Berlin to Havana. And so it was the U.S. government, it was the Joint Chiefs who did it. Well, no, you see what I'm saying? All of these conspirators are going to end up being involved in the JFK assassination. Their common denominator is Cuba. They have all these other interests that are separate from each other and unique, but the common denominator is always Cuba. I cannot stress that enough. If you miss the importance of Cuba and how strategically important it is to all these different constituent groups, these conspirators are going to end up taking out our next government, then you just miss the whole JFK plot. You miss the whole thing. And of course, they're even going to blame the government, the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, for being a pro-Castro. They set him up with this fair play for Cuba. And they set him up with this Mexico City story going to the Cuban embassy. It's always Cuba. It's always Cuba. So if you don't get anything else out of today, I hope you understand that from this point forward, you're going to be hearing a lot about Cuba. You've already heard a lot about Cuba, but this is going to be, the epicenter of an earthquake that is about to happen in U.S. domestic politics. So I hope that was interesting. I find it interesting. I get excited about it. I have to dial myself back a little bit. But anyway, that was episode 82, I believe. Tomorrow we'll be looking at this election and how this Cuban policy and all of these dynamics that we've been talking about are going to come into play to force hands, to force negotiations and agreements and deals between parties so that this election will go the way they want it. In Kennedy's case, he'll win and he'll deal with the Cuba situation afterwards. But boy, it's one of these things, you better come through. These are people, these are serious people. These are serious freaking people. And if you don't come through, they will view it as a betrayal, as a and if you double cross them and do the exact opposite, it's more than a betrayal. It's the unpardonable sin. So that's where we're headed with this starting tomorrow. Check out my website, sphistory.com. Give me a thumbs up. I appreciate it if you do that on my channel. Also, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It's free. Hit the notification bell. Those of you who have been with me for a while, you know I drop content every day of the week, the weekdays anyway, Monday through Friday, and take the weekends off. So uh, that's generally the schedule. But if you hit the notification bell, sometimes I come out with an addendum, something I forgot, I remember during the day, and you'll get a notification bell if that happens, and you'll be able to access that as well. Anyway, I hope everybody has a great day, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks. Goodbye.